Good afternoon. We're starting panel 4 on models of dose-response relationship. So as the chair, I thought I would kick off by putting up one recent dose-response relationship, or actually two. And I put this up really to remind people just how hard it is to do these low-dose radiation-induced cancer studies. They're really difficult. So this UK study had a huge number of individuals. Basically, it had all the children in the whole of the UK who'd ever had a CT scan were found and tracked for this study. So there were 200,000 or so children. So this is an enormous study, and every one of those they had the clinical records for. So you can just imagine, I mean, how much effort went into this. And yet you see that although there appears to be a dose-response relationship in both cases, low doses, the lower error bars still touch 0. So to do a study at even lower doses where you have the power to see an effect is really, really difficult. So my point really is that there really are no credible radiation-induced cancer data at very low doses. So what has surprised me a little bit in this meeting has been the certainty in which people have made statements that there is or there are not radiation-induced cancer effects at low doses. And I think that uncertainty is a little bit unwarranted. I think we still don't know. We don't have the epidemiology. We don't have the full mechanisms. So there's a lot we don't know. So I would urge a little bit of caution in the strong statements that one makes about the effects of radiation in terms of cancer at very low doses. Okay, that's my little diatribe. So we have 4 people on our panel, 2 of which have spoken before, Daryl and Kathy. So Jerry Cutler got 5 minutes, and then Mark, you've got a couple of minutes after that.
Yes, please put up the slides. How do I operate this? Well, talking about CT scans, my colleague Eugene Moore put his wife in hospice on April the 8th, and then he said, help, she's going to die. And I said, well, I've seen reports from Mohan, so I recommended that we try low-dose radiation. The physician, the family doctor said, the only thing I can prescribe is CT scans of the brain. And, she had 3 scans, quick recovery of appetite and cognition, as you can see. And within a few months, July to November, she was discharged from the hospice to a mental care home. Now, Eugene Moore, he has Parkinson. He's the fellow in the black shirt, sweater, and one scan after he saw his wife improve, he got himself 1 scan, and the tremors stopped taking medication. So these are facts. Now, once upon a time, I got to start with a story. Low doses of ionizing radiation were used to cure cancer. This is complete remission. Low doses. Cure infections, gas gangrene, boils, sinuses, inner ear, whooping cough, pneumonia, treating inflammations, and curing asthma. Now we can perhaps add, after we finish our clinical study, Alzheimer's and Parkinson. And all these studies, I've read them carefully, and they don't make any mention of an increased risk of cancer. And these were large doses. They were often measured by SED. Let's go on to the thresholds. Is the LNT wrong? Is it false? Well, Ed Calabrese weighed in on this. Basically what he's saying is the 1956 recommendation of the NAS to switch from threshold to the LNT model was ideologically motivated decision based on deliberate falsification and fabrication of the research record. Now, I've looked at the evidence carefully. I've read all of the references he's been presenting, and makes a very convincing argument for that. Now, I'm going to present evidence of acute dose threshold and chronic dose rate thresholds. You've seen this picture before. It's the area around Hiroshima. We're divided into zones. This is the data by Neil Wald, leukemia in Hiroshima City. These are atomic bomb survivors, published in Science, 1958. So there are the year, the total number of cases, and you can see the distance. And if you look at the total number of cases, there's about 15 plus 30, it's about 48 cases. And the number of people were 10,000 in the first two areas. And when you work out the ratio, the mortality, it's 0.5% of the irradiated people. 0.5%. We're making a big deal now about radiation-induced cancer. Now, leukemia, blood cells, blood-forming cells are very, very sensitive cells, so they're expected to be much more radiation sensitive. And yet, they are showing a very small result from this radiation exposure, incidence of leukemia. Now I plotted the data, Wald's data, and you can see how the cases rise after the bombing in 45. About 5 years it starts to peak, and then it runs down afterwards. There's no point in looking at data after 15 years because the radiation-induced leukemia is disappearing. Now, if you keep adding on data on leukemia, what you're doing is diluting this data with naturally occurring leukemia. So this is the evidence that happened, and this is what we need to look at. Now, this data was tabulated in Unscare, and there you can see the doses at different radiuses, people exposed, the number of cases, and the incidence. And there had to be an adjustment at 50 rad, 50 rem, because of radiation complaints. Oops, what did I do? Okay, there it is. So I plotted the data on log scale, and each dot is a different zone. You can see the high radiation areas near the bomb center. And you can see where I had to make an adjustment. And then you see the linear model, and then the incidence at the outer region, the zone E. You can see this is the natural occurring incidence of leukemia. And so the threshold that comes out from there is rather surprising. It's 0.7. And now look at the chronic data, dose rate, the chronic threshold. This is data by Tom Fritz. And here we have mortality versus days to death. I tried to get an estimate of lifespan, days to death versus dose rate. So I drew a line across 50% mortality to get the median. And this is the tabulation of the 7 groups, the number of dogs, dose rate in milligray per year, the days until death. And this is the data that we have. Got from that data from Tom Fritz. You can see the intersection. It's rather high. This is 670 milligray per year. Okay, this is the pilot study that's starting in Toronto. They're selecting patients this week. We have 7 investigators, and 3 patients are in the pilot. And after we get results, hopefully we'll have enough to start a big study. This is a trial is registered at clinical clinicaltrials.gov. Talking about other treatments. Here's nasal. Okay. No link to any disease. And we're still cutting people's hands off for gas gangrene when we could have treated with. There you go.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you. We'll have more time during the discussion period and perhaps someone from the RARF team might be interested in commenting on the data. Mark, I think you wanted a few words.
Let's see. Yes. Okay. I'll just briefly go over the origins of the Scientists for Accurate Radiation Information and the XLNT. It all started when Fukushima happened, and I used to work at the Monticello nuclear plant in Minnesota, which is exactly identical to the Fukushima plant, so needless to say, it caught my interest. But I was colluding with some other folks and say, man, there's an awful lot of misinformation and radiophobia going along, and we really need to do something about that. You know, you were compelled to respond to some of this stuff, and it's just overwhelming. And so we thought, well, let's do something. And that thing was, let's make a website where we can pool this information. So if you want to respond to something, you can have a peer-reviewed response, because there's really only about 5 or 10 misinformation statements out there. So our objective is simply to get out there and try to counter misinformation when we see it, and prevent fear whenever we can by making sure there's no radiation phobia and a better understanding about what radiation is. And to be very concise and efficient about how we say things. The things that we're saying today, we don't have time to explain to the general public because their eyes will glaze over. Mine are glazing over anyway. And the collaboration is the neat thing, because the members that we've had so far, I've learned more in the last 5 years than in the previous 40 years of my career, because there are some really neat people that I get to work with and have associated with, and associating with you here this week. Some collaboration examples. Used to be in the Health Physics Society, where I was pretty active, you hardly ever spoke about the linear no threshold theory as being wrong, because that was just not polite company. But then 3 years ago, Ludwig van Enigen made special sessions, and not only was there a few people there were so many people there they had to move to bigger rooms because there simply wasn't enough space. I've also learned to set up a Facebook page for CERI, which is a great means of communicating with the public. I see here in this particular post, I got 1,700 likes out of that, and that just multiplies my ability to communicate good information. I look at the information and see if it's worthy of putting up there, because we're very careful about making sure we don't overstate the case. Okay. So anyway, as Mohan pointed out, there's a booth out there, and there's some sign-up lists if you want to have more information and join us. That would be great. It doesn't cost anything, and the collaboration is great. So there you go.
Thanks a lot. So actually, following on from the last session, Dr. Fontos actually had some comments, and there wasn't time to express them there. So Barry, the stage is yours.
Thank you, David. Thank you, David. I just would like to comment on Dr. Doss's presentation. Thank you, Dr. Doss, for that interesting information. One of the slides caused me some concern. I saw that it pertained to Tature River cohort, and I believe the date of the publication was 1994. Well, this program, Russian Health Studies program, which we discussed yesterday in a special scientific session, began in 1994, and as of December 2017, there are 342 peer-reviewed publications. Over half of those pertain to the dosimetry and epidemiology, both of which have been improved over time since the program began. When one does a literature review, I'm just surprised how it would be, how one could overlook everything published on that cohort since 1994. And so, for example, if you were paying attention to my presentation yesterday, you would have seen on one of the slides that I presented statistically significant dose response in the Techu River cohort for solid cancer mortality. That was published by Schoenfeld et al. In 2013. Also for solid cancer incidence after adjusting for smoking, that was published by Davis et al. In 2015. Those two studies show linear relationships. In addition, there was also statistically significant excesses from non-chronic lymphocytic leukemia incidence. That was published by Kristinina et al. In 2013. So I won't repeat what the cancer risk estimates are. You can go back and refer to the slide. I also mentioned that there was no evidence of radiation effect for chronic lymphocytic leukemia. But the non-chronic lymphocytic leukemia excess cancer incidence was a quadratic relationship. So I just would like to recommend that when someone is going to make pronouncements at a meeting and show evidence, purported evidence of the lack of effect or an effect, that they do a thorough literature review and take all the evidence into consideration. Thank you.
Thank you. That's certainly a fair comment. Yeah, perhaps you'd like to respond, Dr. Doss?
There is a major problem with the studies that look at the cancer risk or the number of cancers observed as a function of radiation dose and fit it to a LNT model shape and then claim increased cancer risk from the low radiation doses. The best way to determine if there is a cancer risk is to compare to an equivalent population which is not irradiated. And that is what the 1994 study was. And if you have data similar to this, comparison to the equivalent cohort, then I would certainly take that into consideration. A similar situation exists for the Taiwan apartment study, where the first study reported in comparison to control population, and in the second and third updates, they use the LNT model to fit the data for certain cancers, and they should increase risk, whereas if you calculated the actual comparison to the control population, it still showed reduction of 20% cancer that I showed. So if you can, I tried to do that type of calculation with the data that you published in, I think, 2017, but I could not, I mean, it was very complex and it was hard to convert it into that type of calculation. So if you have the data as comparison to controls, or I can ask you for what numbers I want, if you can give it, then I'm willing to calculate it and see if it still continues. So I did look at your publication, but that's the reason I did not use it.
Thank you. Following on from my initial comment, I mean, all low-dose epidemiological studies are difficult to do, and they all have their biases, unquestionably. So one has to try and figure out the biases. But one should certainly not criticize one set of data because it doesn't agree with your point of view and not criticize another. One should be equally critical of all data sets, I think.
Sure.
And they all have their problems. Tony.
I was going to almost say exactly what you said, David. I'm not an epidemiologist, but I know that when you take Bernie Cohen and say that this is what radon does, and then you ignore all the European studies, and you ignore a lot of the uranium miner studies, then you're doing a little bit of what we used to call Ernie Sternglass. We called him Ernie the Attorney because Ernie would go around and find anything that supported his point of view and use it. Anything that did not support his point of view, he wouldn't use. So I think we have to be really careful that our own preconceived notions don't drive our conclusions. And so I like the concept of SERI, and I think it's a good concept, but I have one small problem, and that is that they want to, how would I say it? They want to point fingers at people and call some people crooked because their science doesn't agree with what their preconceived notions are. Now, I've been in science a long time, and I know that several of us have argued with each other before. And it doesn't mean that I'm crooked or that somebody else is crooked just because we have a different point of view. It's like my students would come to me and say, Dr. Brooks, the experiment didn't work. Well, what do you mean it didn't work? Well, you know, we had the protocol all written out, and this is what's supposed to happen. I says, you mean the animals didn't read your protocol? The experiment worked, and you've got to understand how to interpret it. And so I think we have to be really careful that we don't try to ride our own personal opinions over onto our interpretations.
That's a good point. Thank you.
So I have an observation that leads me to ask a question. You know, my area of expertise is not radiation, but in listening for the past 2 days, it seems like there's a great deal of interest in LNT versus not LNT. But my question would be simply this: is it LNT, and is everything in the framework of LNT because that came first? And if you were to look at what the epidemiologists said yesterday, and look at what the health physicists are saying today, and look at what the biologists have said this morning, and if you look at the data, all of your data in the context of a different framework, would you still devise LNT? So instead of arguing about LNT, would you come up with something different?
Well, I think most of the epi papers that are published these days fit the data to try a linear model, they try a linear quadratic model, and they look for thresholds, and they have the threshold as a free parameter and see what it is and what its confidence limits are. So people, I think, do look at alternate models when they're analyzing their epidemiology.
I think my question is bigger than that. Why is the framework LNT? Is that because it was first? I mean, was that the first framework that was devised? Because I've heard a lot of discussion that, you know, we're for LNT, we're not for LNT, we believe in hormesis, we don't. So my question is, so would you frame it differently?
If you were to start over, would it be the same model?
If you were to start over, knowing what you did today, would it be the same model?
Well, in my view, it would be a linear model because there is a mechanistic background to the LNT. It has its uncertainties, that's true. But I don't know of any other models that have a mechanistic framework associated with them. So I think it's reasonable to use the LNT as the initial model, and you can test other models as well. Historically, it's sort of obvious that you start with a linear model.
Right. Nope. Thank you very much.
Now I have to respond to two things. I just want to respond to Tony that nobody in SERI has accused anybody of being crooked. We do talk about biases and so on, but that's not the same thing. Ed Calabrese has called the genetics panel in 1956, the BIR1 panel, crooked, but he also has evidence of internal memos that demonstrate that. He didn't just throw it around, but that's just simply not true. And in terms of David, were you here this morning?
Was I here this morning?
You talk about there's no mechanisms or the mechanisms support linearity. My God, everything this morning said the opposite. I don't understand how you can say that.
Hi, Chris Clement. I'm Scientific Secretary of ICRP. I apologize for not asking a question, but the panel can react to a comment. I want to say a couple of things about the previous session that I thought were quite good. That's how a Canadian starts with a criticism, by the way. First of all, there were a couple of things I particularly picked out of Dr. Doss's presentation that I appreciated very much and I think are important points. One of which is that we should be looking at the whole person. Obviously, all our studies can't do that. You have to look at mechanisms at much lower levels of, much lower scales. We can't put humans into cages and irradiate them in radiation chambers. So you have to look at mouse models, cell cultures, and so on. But the result is protection of the whole human, not against one kind of cancer or one circumstance. And it's about the protection of all people, not just one person in one circumstance of one age and so on. So that's, I think, a key point, looking at the whole person, and quite interesting results that Dr. Doss showed. The other, it's been raised a couple of times, dose rate matters. It seems that that's probably true. We've seen some preliminary thoughts from Task Group 91. We're in a room, discussed them yesterday, where dose rate seems to make a difference. But I want to look at the bigger picture. So my basic comment is about where we agree. I hope everyone in the room agrees that if you get big doses, you have trouble. You get cancer or worse things happen at big doses. I hope no one disagrees with that. As the doses go down, the risk goes down. I think people agree with that too, generally. How they go down to where they go, that's not agreed. Fair enough. But the way I look at it is that once you get to some level of millisieverts or whatever, results are lost in a seas of uncertainty. We saw the picture that David put up just before at the beginning of this session. You can argue that that shows a threshold. You can argue that that's consistent with LNT. You can argue it's consistent with lots of models. But the point is that data isn't inconsistent with a variety of models. So we don't really know. In addition, there's lots of definitive looking studies that don't agree with other definitive looking studies at low doses and low dose rates. And we have to understand that this is where we are. We live in an era where we don't really understand in detail what's going on at low doses and dose rates. How do we get out of it? More research is the scientist's answer, and I don't mind that answer at all, especially looking at low doses and low dose rates. And Julian Preston, actually yesterday, I'm sure he's still in the room, had some good advice on how that might be managed more efficiently. And second, because we as a society and ICRP as part of our mandate have a responsibility to contribute to protection of people, how do we run a system of protection to protect people with this uncertainty at these low doses and dose rates? For me, that's the central question. We're not going to answer what's the risk at 20 millisieverts in this room today or probably in the next 20 years. The opinions will vary for probably longer than I'll be alive. But we have to answer the question of how do we behave with this uncertainty in a responsible fashion. Thank you.
Yeah, I think everyone could agree with that the issue is how we respond to the uncertainty that we have. And it's not an easy question.
Good afternoon. I introduced myself yesterday as 22 years of experience of managing the radiation physics for the Nevada test site. Today I'd like to talk to you about a real-life experience that occurred at the Eniwetok cleanup.
I have to say we're absolutely on. Oh no, we have till 4:30 or 4.
4:30.
Oh, no, sorry. Please continue. My apologies. Please.
Well, in the last half of the 70s, it was decided by government with the DNA and that's the Defense Nuclear Agency and the DOE to go out and clean up the test area at the Eniwetok Atoll. As we prepared for that and mapped out the radioactivity, we spent years doing that and then launched a major cleanup in 1977. Well, I thought Daryl gave a really good talk earlier today that showed the decrease with radiation protection standards. Well, if the LNT model is the driver of that, I hate it. I hate it for this very reason that I'm about to tell you. We experienced that cleanup and we killed 6 men doing it. We brought them home in body bags. we had 54 lost time accidents because it was a construction project cleaning up a program that the environmental impact statement for the no-fault condition projected 1 latent cancer in 30 years for a returning population of the Inuit-Takis of 1,000 people. That was no fault. Well, we went ahead and cleaned up at a ridiculous low level that made it really difficult for us health physicists to measure the radioactivity in the soil. And I, up until that time, trying to invoke standards at the Nevada test site, I didn't have a lot of problem with the LNT and all of the crap that was coming down the way of regulations, because I could just pass it on to my contractors and sit on their butts and tell them to do the things that they had to do. I thought that was pretty straightforward. And it wasn't until the Inuit experience that I realized that what we were doing with these very low doses and very low, translated to very low cleanup criteria, we were transferring the risk to real people. We're calculating the risk to mythological people and transferring to real people. And I wrote a paper, and it was published in 2000 in the ESPC, International Pollution Research Journal. I entitled that The Unacknowledged Transfer of Risk, and I went through all of the criteria that got us there in the way of the stupid cleanup criteria invoked by EPA and all of their lowering of the standards that was very eloquently talked about today. But, and I didn't think much about the Inuit cleanup till I got home and started pondering on what in the world happened. That we're killing real people trying to move some soil around when it really probably didn't need to be done. Plus all the other injuries that we had out there. And I finally decided I got to write about this. Just maybe to make me feel better, if nothing else. A year later, I had the opportunity to expand that research and use the UMTRAP data. For those of you who don't know what UMTRAP, that's the Uranium Mill Tailings Cleanup Criteria, or Cleanup Project. And I spent over a week at Grand Junction, where all of those documents are housed, copying all of the EISs and the cleanup reports and doing a data analysis, and I found a similar pattern. Almost no risk, but yet we were transporting all of this soil from point A to point B, and that's the definition of a cleanup. Transportation, basically soil from point A to point B. It's going on here in Hanford in spades, transporting point A to point B. We've done it at the Nevada test site. I've been on half a dozen major cleanups. My deputy assistant manager said I was the AEC's garbage man, because I was basically involved with all of these stupid cleanups that we had to do. Utilizing this extremely low-level criteria espoused by the EPA, driven by, I think, the LNT. Anyway, we need to think about the impact on real people. When you transfer the risk, which is a 6th-order risk, to a 4th-order risk for serious accidents, to a 2-order risk for, 4th-order risk for death, and a 2-order risk for injury, there's something wrong in that picture. And we not only need to do some of the things we're talking about here, but we need to start thinking about the impact on real people. Because we bury real people. We don't bury these mythological people we do with all of these collective doses. Now, I'm a downwinder. I've known Tony since we were kids. And I've had a lot to do, being an AEC DOE employee, dealing with the downwinders. And you want to talk to a bunch of people that are scared to death about getting cancer? Well, done a lot of dose reconstruction for all the downwinders, and I think the highest doses were 6 rem, way below 10. And yet, if you have one of the 17 cancers that is listed in the LSS study, that's an automatic, and of course you got to live in some counties, there's geographical, some time differences, you get a check for $50,000.
Well, I think your point about the 1 millisievert per year limit is well taken.
Good.
I would suspect there's very few people in this room who think that this 1 millisievert per year
Well,
limit
my
is
point is,
appropriate.
if you walk away from here thinking that all of this stuff doesn't have impact on real people, you're really, really mistaken. Because it impacts on a lot of people. It impacted on Congress. I attend a lot of hearings in the late 70s and early 80s, which culminated in the RECA. If you don't know what that is, that's the act where you get the $50,000. Totally unfair, because there's a lot of people got exposure in Utah that don't get nothing. And there's people in Arizona that got no exposure, but they get the check. It was just political, is all it was. But my point is, there's a lot of people out there that are scared to death because they believe in this theory that one hit, one atom, one photon, they're going to get cancer. And they know they all got it. Well, what they don't understand is everybody in the world got it. Because, worldwide fallout didn't care where it fell. It fell on everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. As I say, I believe that this 1 millisievert per year limit there's probably no one in this room who thinks that's reasonable. But there are all sorts of factors that went into that 1 millisievert per year limit, and the dose-response relationship that was used is one factor in that, but there are many others. And ultimately, it was a determination of what risk level the ICRP or whoever wanted to accept, while knowing, of course, the enormous uncertainties involved. So I don't think you could put it all on LNT caused 1 millisievert per year in some sense.
I just wanted to ask a question about something you said earlier in response to the other question. You mentioned that ICRP and NCRP or other organizations had looked at alternative models to LNT. And yet when I see these presentations, that's all I see. And it should be self-evident that if you don't constrain the zero dose point to go through zero relative risk, you're going to get a better fit to the data than if you make that assumption. So I don't understand why you think, I don't see evidence that alternate models have been examined.
I guess I was thinking of all the ABOM survivor studies. They always have look at thresholds and try and estimate what the threshold would be. I guess I wasn't talking about ICRP or NCRP.
I want to respond to the radon data comment that Tony made. There are plenty of studies that do an LNT model fit to the case control studies and determine excess risk per radon level. But there are also case control studies that compare the lung cancer rates between low radon levels and higher radon levels. And when you compare the cancer rates, you see that the higher radon levels have lower level of cancers. But you can take that data and fit it to a LNT model and come up with a risk coefficient that's looks like noise, because you look at, all the pooled data and all these studies, all of those together come with a slightly increased risk, which is like noise. I think the fault is in analyzing the data using the LNT model when all the evidence that I showed shows reduction of cancer. So you need to actually, I think the best way to do it is to compare the cancer risk and then just see if there is an increased risk or reduced risk. Just one more comment about the very low doses, 0.1 millisievert or cancer risk from that. If you are trying to measure the effect of jumping 2 times from 2 feet every day, the health effect of that on your normal cancer or normal health risk, you will find it's in the noise. That somebody will say, yeah, some studies will say they'll increase, somebody will decrease. You are trying to measure noise. So there's no point in measuring the cancer risk at extremely low, like 0 dose levels. If you measure at a reasonable level, like 5, 50, 100 millisieverts, then you've seen reduction of cancers. If you measure at 1 millisievert or 5 millisieverts, you are looking at noise. I mean, you can spend all your time measuring noise. It has no relevance to human health because you are basically looking at noise. I mean, so that's my opinion. So, and when you go to 50 to 100 millisieverts, there is in fact reduction of cancers I showed in many studies.
Yeah, I think you make a good point. I mean, when you get down to really low doses, you're absolutely in the noise, and it's very hard to make statements about what those measurements might mean.
If you cannot measure the risk at all with spending billions of dollars, that risk is too small to worry about. I think, but if you do a linear extrapolation from there to low doses where there is reduced risk, so you can conclude that there would be a slight reduction of cancers at very low doses, which you cannot measure. So I think you should just measure at near 50, 100 millisieverts, and then I have shown the data, and I can send you the data if you want. You can look at it.
I think what the epidemiologists do is measure as low a dose as they can possibly do with some significant power. To me, that seems the reasonable, that's all they can do. At lower doses, we're forced into uncertainty and models, and we have to say we don't really know what's happening at these lower doses.
No, if you look at the low dose data, not one of the studies has shown increased cancer risk significant at the 95% level. There's not one study in all of the studies that were like NCRP reported the studies and all these things. Of course, you can look at the high doses and then fit a straight line and then claim excess related risk per sievert, but that does not mean, I mean, that relates to high doses. It does not relate to low doses. Anyway.
Well, our problem is in doses below which no one could even think of attempting epidemiology. What do we do there? And there we have a great deal of uncertainty.
We don't waste our time doing studies where you cannot measure the risk of cancer. I mean, there are much more important things to do than to waste the public resources. Measuring noise, you can spend a lot of money. It does not benefit public. It benefits us as scientists, but I would rather spend the money on improving the health of the public, like trying to solve the diseases rather than doing such studies.
Well, I think what we need is a mechanistic understanding of what goes on at low doses, and if we have to use mice to do those studies, that's what we need to do.
I just would like to add on hormesis a little bit. I believe that it occurs, but we have to take into account that more and more evidence showing that hormesis is not universal. Not only the work that I presented this morning, I think poster number 2 also the same thing. And also a few years ago, the work from Dr. Bobby Scott from Lovelace, with a lot of us, some of us here know him. It's very clear that hormesis is not universal. And also the review paper by Dr. Dukoff, DUCFF, he's kind of warned us that hormesis actually is happening, but we have to take into account that it's not universal. Okay, that's only.
This is more for Jerry. You presented some pretty nice data that's non-cancer related, showing beneficial effects of low-dose radiation with Alzheimer's, and you were starting to talk about gangrene and things like that. but time kind of shut up. Could you just expand on that? And then also another question is, you were talking about your some epidemiology study with cancer, and you said you had to shift the data point and your rationale behind that.
Thank you. The study I was quoting was the leukemia study. The data that was measured by Wall and the graph that I plotted that was in UNSCARE, there was a point that I moved from 50 to 100 rem, and that was because the patients living or who were exposed in that zone complained of severe effects from the radiation, health effects. They were in pain. And so I decided that the calculation of the dose that was done with models of the atomic bomb were not appropriate when you have live data from humans expressing an effect that was due to a much higher radiation dose. And so I moved that point and I got a better fit. And the threshold that comes out from that is 700 millirem, or 0.7 sieverts is the threshold for radiation-induced leukemia. Yeah, 700 millisieverts or 70 rem. And well, that's a very significant threshold and for an acute dose. And people are talking doses that are 100 times lower thresholds. And so we got to recognize that this is valid data and should use it. And of course, we have the evidence of pre-1960s, all those treatments on, they didn't report evidence of cancer, even long-term studies. They treated thousands and thousands of patients, and this was reviewed later by National Cancer Institute for nasal radiation treatment of inflammations and also removal of tissue for the eustachian tube for the Navy pilots, 8,000 of them. They followed up and they saw no evidence of any disease from those high exposures of radium. So this is important evidence that people are ignoring. And we've got to use it. We've got to look at it. Thank you.
Hello, my name's Grant S. Meadows. I didn't introduce myself, I think, yesterday. Student at University of Wisconsin-Madison. So I'm just here to ask the audience, because we have a bunch of very esteemed professionals here that would have a large influence on the ICRP and the NCRP. Would, just a vote of hands, who would want to raise the limits from 1 millisievert a year to 5 millisieverts a year for the general public? Or higher. Well, no, I'll keep it at 5 millisieverts for now. So I just want to say that if we can write up as a result of this conference, that seems to be almost unanimous. Thanks.
I have a question for Dr. Higley. You seem so happy over there. I thought I would kind of. Going to ruin her day. I thought your presentation was really very nice in the way you talked about social factors, economic factors, political factors having to be mixed in with science to get a standard, to decide a cleanup level, whatever. So I wanted to just ask you, let's say hypothetically we arrived at some level that we felt was a safe level, whether we used LNT, whether we used a threshold, whatever we used. And there was general agreement in the scientific community that this level was the right level to protect health. What would be the social, political, economic, other factors that you would have us think about in either driving that level lower or setting it higher?
So I'm not a social scientist, don't pretend to be one.
It's okay, you can play one.
I'm a health physicist, and I'm actually a radioecologist. And but I recognize for any solution to work, it can't be top down by fiat. This is what you've got to do. If you're imposing it on a community, it's not going to work. You have to have a conversation. And there are people in this audience that have done a much better job of having conversations with large audiences with regard to radiation impacts than I have done. Listening to Dr. Church, Mr. Church's talk about the effects of remediation at Eniwetok and the actual lives lost, I think about in the environmental remediation category, the kind of low-dose numbers I deal with are a factor of 100 or a factor of 1,000 smaller than the cutoff for all the epidemiological studies. But we're moving millions of tons of dirt, we're putting big trucks on the road, and we are destroying environments with the intent of protecting something. And so I know that we need to have a conversation about what is the right thing, what is the right limit to set. So I'm kind of avoiding answering your question.
Let me add just a minute to what Dr. Higley and Bruce Church said, because I worked for 10 years on the uranium mill tailings cleanup project, and I did an environmental impact statement, or EIS, for virtually every one of the sites. There were 24 mill sites in 10 states that qualified for cleanup, and we did all that. We spent a couple of billion, $3 billion doing it, and we killed 4 people. They were incidental deaths. It had nothing to do with radiation, of course, but and I don't want to say the cleanup didn't need to have happened, but the incidental deaths, we spent $3 billion to kill 4 people. That kind of, it doesn't sound right.
Actually, my comment kind of piggybacks on what you just said. A lot of the criticism I've heard is, well, we are looking at the LNT model versus hormesis or threshold models, but a lot of the criticism I'm hearing is actually not around the model, but it's around a misunderstanding of the ALARA concept. People seem to have forgotten the reasonable part of ALARA and have gone well beyond what is reasonable into what's actually harmful. So I just want to put that out there that we should separate the scientific endeavors from the, I'm not sure exactly where it comes from, bureaucracy or what, but sometimes where we've gone beyond ALARA.
Let me add to that just a brief thing. It's the ALARA principle is based on a principle, the ALARA principle, and it ought to be the ALARA approach. Just like common sense, and when you walk up close to the cliff, you approach the cliff, but you don't, as a matter of principle, stay away from cliffs because they're fun to look over.
Hi, I'm Bruce Napier. You might remember me from yesterday. I have another life other than dose reconstruction, and one of them, one of my alternative lives is dealing with cleanup of old facilities at the Hanford site. If you're from around this area, you realize that there's one of them called the plutonium finishing plant. And as a disclaimer, I'm up to here in the plutonium finishing plant. But I would like to say that last December, there was a contamination event. Some plutonium got spread around. A number of people were exposed. And they shut down basically all demolition projects in the DOE complex for several months, and they're just now restarting here at Hanford. That particular event, they did fecal analysis on 320 people and determined that the total collective dose in the worker population was 29 person millirem. It's cost several $1 million, so the total R in ALARA right now is about $2 billion a man-rem. What I would say is that I don't really care about the shape of the curve. The problem, as Roger McClellan brought up yesterday, is implementation. In the Department of Energy regulations, the workers can get 5,000 millirem a year each, and it can be some combination of internal and external. When these people inhaled a little teeny bit of plutonium, the DOE managers back in DC went, oh my God, how can we tell these workers that they've inhaled plutonium when we know that a single particle of plutonium in your lungs is a death sentence? We have a problem with implementation of the existing regulations. It's totally out of control. Something needs to be done. I don't have a problem with, 1 millisievert for the public and 50 for the workers, but we're nowhere near that in any case because of the way we apply the existing rules.
Dan Strom, USTUR. We were all very moved by Bruce Church's comments. I haven't heard this room silent for 5 minutes before during this meeting. And he pointed out the downside, the 6 body bags and 54 lost time injuries. There are lots of people who lose their lives and have lost time injuries as lumberjacks. And so I think we need to always think of ICRP's first principle of radiation protection, which is justification. No practice shall be adopted unless it produces a net positive benefit. And so the people who are doing the cleanup at Eniwetok, or the people who die being lumberjacks, get the benefit of a paycheck. And furthermore, they get the benefit of, many of them, maybe not lumberjacks, but many people get health insurance, which is, from a public health standpoint, the most important thing you can do for people's well-being, not worrying about a millisievert here or there, but making sure they have insurance if they do get sick. So I'd like to never just look at body bags without realizing that the workers who were doing that, whether it was necessary or not, were getting a paycheck and maybe they were getting health insurance. And it sounds to me like that was as dangerous as being a lumberjack. But still, let's never forget that people go to work in dangerous professions to get a paycheck and the other benefits that come with a job. So I was really moved by what Bruce said, but those people were also getting some benefit. I don't know if it was really unusually risky, but let's keep that in mind.
I'd like to respond to that. Every time I have told people about that, I always get that thing, that comment, well, they got a paycheck, so they were the, and that's true. But these were military young men, and their paycheck wasn't very high. And furthermore, I don't have a problem if they're doing something worthwhile. And I think that comment is probably on target. But when you're doing something as cleaning up, something that don't need to be cleaned up, then that's baloney. When we put people at risk, it doesn't need to be put at risk because the objective of what you're doing is worthless. Then it is a total transfer of risk and there is no benefit to those employees. And it was risky because it's heavy construction, bulldozers, front end loaders, caterpillars, transport hauling across the lagoon to the disposal site. One of them, the guy got crushed between a bulldozer and a dump truck. Another Navy guy got blown up because he was welding down in his boat because we had to have boats to move people over there. 2 other guys got lost in the lagoon. And I think a year later their boat was found in Saipan.
We need to move on to our last couple of questions here, I think.
You got to be careful. You're going to press my button.
Your point is taken.
Nick Daniak at Yale. I'm detecting some movement here in this conversation. And tomorrow, we'll be wrapping up tomorrow with a path forward. There's a lot of talent in this room, in both among radiobiologists and radiation epidemiologists. David's actually mentioned, well, it's important to have mechanisms, and mechanisms are things that we in radiation biology find easy to come up with. Radiation biologists would enjoy participating in epidemiological type studies on people. We need each other, frankly, in order to move to the next step. And so I would recommend that people start thinking along those lines, maybe overnight, and tomorrow have conversations, preferably with the other side. And in order to open up more of a dialogue, to see if we can get closer to some sort of consensus. Again, tomorrow afternoon we're going to be talking about path forward. It would be nice to have a path forward where most people can sign on to it. Not everyone, but most people. So just a comment.
That's a very good comment.
Chip Gribble with the California EPA. Actually, not quite, because I just retired. But I like to pretend sometimes. So that story about the workers killed at Eniwetok was made it pretty personal, and thank you for the story. And that was, in all fairness, that was in the 70s, you said? And I'm not sure how the OSHA operated in those days, but in this day and age,
OSHA, Navy is not subject to OSHA.
Navy's not subject to OSHA. But in
Legal operations.
Sure. But the project manager in charge of that whole thing is responsible, and I've done many cleanups in my 25 years working for the state of California. I'm not OSHA either, but as a regulator overseeing cleanups, I take a certain ownership to that type of thing. Regulatorily, I have no role, but if I see, and I'm supposed to watch, if I see something that isn't looking right, I'm supposed to bring in the other agencies so that they can make sure that it's done safely. And those contractors should be, fined and run out of business and shape up or get out, kind of a thing. So there's a way that that's supposed to be controlled. On the other hand, I'll confess that I don't know that that's taken into account in our risk assessment process. And I feel caught flat-footed, and now I'm compelled to go back and try to figure out how to take that into account. On the other hand, I'm just thinking off the top of my head here, if that were part of the calculus, doesn't that somewhat legitimize a certain number of deaths in turn for a project and expecting that to happen? And that seems to be not quite right either. There's something that doesn't sound right. But it's a very compelling issue that I'm going to want to go back and try to figure out. Anyway, that's my 2 bits.
So our very last question of this session.
Actually, 2 items. One a news item. I don't know if any of you looked out the Washington Post today. There's an article that Trump's EPA is going to loosen the radiation standards based on work with Ed Calabrese. So just thought that would be of interest to everybody here. So it could change the limits quite substantially. And I was also intrigued by, I've been talking about Dr. McCullough and myself, I'm going to be at the next session, and I was very intrigued by the question from the University of Wisconsin student about what 5 millisievert, what would the limit be? And Dr. McCullough and myself had an interesting discussion yesterday about if you've got a knock on your door at 2 a.m. in the morning and someone says there's an increased radiation level in your area and you're going to get X millisieverts over the next year, what would make you get out of bed and leave your house? And I was going, well, what level would make me get out of bed? 10 millisieverts? Nope, I'm not moving. 20? Probably not. So I was going to have a quick survey here just to give that student a better answer. What would make you get out of bed and leave your house if someone said the radiation level is going to be high for a year and you could get, so I say 100 millisieverts, how many people would leave their house? 100 millisieverts over the next year. Maybe 2. So basically only 2 people would leave for 100 millisieverts over a year. How about 200 millisieverts? Okay, so now, so that student, wherever you are, 100 millisieverts, I'm guessing that'd be it. Well, that's... So if they say, yeah, so let's put it this way. If you did what happened in Fukushima, where you take people in a nursing home and put them into somewhere away from their environment, away from all their friends, where you basically cause all the casualties because of the displacement of those people, nothing to do with radiation. If someone said a camp, a tent somewhere, 100 miles away, I probably wouldn't move for 100 millisieverts. If someone said a nice hotel in Vegas, I'd be gone at 10 millisieverts. So that's what I should have qualified it that way. But we're guessing about 100 millisieverts. Thank you. I just wanted to...
Well, thank you. And I have to thank everyone in the audience for a really stimulating session. And I hope there is a path forward.